She was reviewing a client's financial documents at her desk when she found the address. A house on Birchwood Crescent, Oakville, Ontario. A house she had driven past 100 times. A house where her husband said he spent Thursday evenings visiting his mother. The folder was thick. A divorce case, routine on the surface. Her client, a woman named Sandra Beaumont, was separating from her husband of 6 years. Sera had taken the file without thinking much of it. Contested assets, shared accounts, 2 children under 5. The kind of case that landed on her desk every other week. But the address stopped her completely. She set down her coffee. She read it again. 14 Birchwood Crescent, Oakville. Not a coincidence she could talk herself out of. She knew that street. She knew that house. She had stood in the driveway of that house 3 months ago, helping Marcus carry in groceries because his mother had sprained her wrist. She had thought the neighborhood was lovely. She had thought a lot of things. Her name was Sera Calloway. She was 34 years old, a family law attorney at a mid-sized firm in downtown Toronto. She had been married to Marcus Whitmore for 4 years. He was a financial consultant, warm and easy with people, the kind of man who remembered the names of waitresses and held doors open without thinking about it. She had loved that about him from the beginning. They met at a friend's cottage on Georgian Bay the summer she turned 30. He had been reading on the dock when she arrived, squinting at the water, and he looked up when she walked past and said, without any preamble, that he liked her shoes. She told him they were impractical for a dock. He said that was probably true. They talked until the sun went down, until everyone else had moved inside, until the mosquitoes were unbearable, and neither of them wanted to stop. He called her 2 days after the cottage weekend. He called her again the day after that. By October, they were spending every weekend together. By January, she had a drawer at his apartment. By the following spring, he was on one knee in the middle of a Sunday farmer's market in Kensington, a small box in his hand, completely unbothered by the people watching. She said yes before he finished the question. She was embarrassed about that later, in a fond way. Their life together was ordinary in the best sense of the word. They lived in a semi-detached in the West End of Toronto, close enough to the Bloor subway line that she could walk to the station on dry days. She grew rosemary in a pot on the kitchen windowsill. He had a habit of leaving the sports section of the paper on the kitchen table, even though neither of them actually read the paper anymore. They argued about whose turn it was to call the plumber, and whose turn it was to pick up the dry cleaning, and they made up quickly because neither of them was very good at staying angry. She had told her colleagues she had the boring kind of marriage, the good kind. She said that a lot in the year before she found the address. The name of the client's husband was listed on page 3 of the intake form. Marcus T. Whitmore, date of birth, February 12, 1983. Same as her husband, same initial, same last name. She turned back to page 1 and looked at Sandra Beaumont's photograph, standard ID for the file. A woman in her mid-30s. Dark hair, warm brown eyes, a guarded expression that Sera had seen 100 times across her desk. A woman who was tired of being hurt. Sera sat in her office for a while. Her door was closed. Through the glass partition, she could see her assistant, Priya, on the phone, laughing at something. The firm's open floor hummed with the ordinary noise of a Wednesday afternoon. She stood up. She walked to the window. She looked down at King Street and watched people move along the sidewalk below, small and purposeful in their winter coats. She breathed. Then she sat back down and kept reading. Sandra and Marcus had been together for 7 years, married for 6. They had 2 children, a boy named Owen, and a girl named Lily, ages 5 and 3. The intake notes listed the matrimonial home as 14 Birchwood Crescent, Oakville, the same address where Marcus Whitmore, her Marcus, said his mother lived. The mother Sera had met exactly twice. A quiet woman named Janet who asked careful questions over dinner and complimented Sera's earrings. A woman who, Sera now understood, may not have been anyone's mother at all. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She picked it up again. She texted Marcus, "Working late tonight, don't wait up." He replied within 2 minutes. "No problem, Seth. I'll save you some dinner." 3 small words and a heart. The shorthand of a man who did not know the floor had just shifted beneath them both. She sat with the file for another hour. She read it 3 times. She took notes on a yellow legal pad in her neat cursive and then folded the paper and put it in her blazer pocket. She was a lawyer. She assessed. She was methodical. She had cross-examined witnesses who cried on the stand, and she had presented evidence in rooms that smelled like old carpet, and managed to keep her voice level the entire time. She would keep her voice level now. Before she left the office, she knocked on her senior partner's door. Colin Mercer was 61, unhurried, and had seen most things. She told him she had a conflict of interest in the Beaumont file and needed to reassign it. He didn't ask questions. He said he'd give it to Wendy. She thanked him and left. She drove home on the Gardner because she needed the time, and because the traffic on the Gardner was always bad, and she needed something to sit inside. She thought about Owen and Lily, 5 and 3. She thought about the timeline. Marcus and Sandra had been together for 7 years. Marcus and Sera had been together for 5. She had met him in the 2nd year of his other relationship. She parked on their street and sat in the car for 11 minutes. The front light was on. She could see the faint flicker of the television through the curtains in the living room. She went inside. Marcus was on the couch, watching something she didn't recognize. He looked up when she came in and smiled, and she thought, not for the first time, that he had a very good smile. Easy, unhurried. The kind that arrived first and asked questions later. She used to love that about him. She said she had a headache and was going to bed early. He said he'd bring her tea. She said not to bother. She went upstairs, she changed. She lay in the dark and listened to the small sounds of the house. She did not sleep. She had been trying for a year to get pregnant. They had talked about it, planned it, and for the past 8 months, had been trying with the specific, exhausting focus that took all the spontaneity out of the project. She was tracking cycles and reading nutritional studies, and she had changed her coffee order and started going to bed at 10:30. Marcus had been patient and steady and present through all of it, the way he was patient and steady and present through everything, and she had loved him for that. Owen was 5. Owen was born while Marcus was seeing Sera. While Marcus was steady and patient and present, she pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and breathed. Over the next 4 days, she watched and she learned. She was a lawyer. She knew how to build a case quietly. She knew what questions to ask, and she knew how not to ask them in a way that telegraphed what she already knew. She went through Marcus's home office while he was at the gym on Saturday morning. Not searching desperately but methodically, the way she read through a disclosure package, looking for what didn't fit. She found a secondary bank account in his name, linked to a credit card she had never seen. She found a folder of receipts, restaurants in Oakville and Mississauga, grocery stores, a children's shoe store in Burlington. She found a photograph tucked inside a copy of a book on the middle shelf. A photo of 2 small children at the beach. A little boy in a red swim shirt and a girl with her arms raised, laughing at something outside the frame. She stood with the photograph in her hand for a long time. She called her closest friend, Deb, that evening. Deb was a pharmacist in Hamilton who had known Sera since university and who had the rare ability to listen completely before she said anything at all. Sera told her what she had found. She heard Deb go very still on the other end. "What do you need?" Deb said. "I need someone to drive with me," Sera said. "Next Thursday." Deb came. They drove to Oakville on a Thursday afternoon in early March, the lake still frozen along the shore, the sky a flat gray that made everything look like a photograph. Sera parked a block down from Birchwood Crescent. They sat in Deb's car because Sera's was too recognizable. They waited 40 minutes. Then the front door opened. A woman came out with 2 children, a boy in a navy jacket and a girl in yellow boots. Toddling down the front steps with both hands on the railing, Sandra Beaumont. She looked different from her intake photograph, less guarded. She was laughing at something the boy said, crouching down to zip up the girl's jacket, and there was nothing in her manner that suggested a woman who suspected anything. She looked like a woman who believed her life was intact. Sera watched her from a block away and felt something she had not expected. Not anger at Sandra, something much more like recognition. The particular exhaustion of a woman doing everything on her own, while someone else went back and forth between her world and another one, carrying nothing between them, leaving no fingerprints. She said to Deb, "She doesn't know." Deb said, "No." They drove back to Toronto. On the highway, Sera looked at the gray sky and the gray lake and thought with the methodical part of her brain that had carried her through a law degree and articling and 7 years of family practice. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what Sandra Beaumont knew. She thought about Owen and Lily, who did not know anything, who only knew their dad came home some nights and didn't come home others, and who had probably learned not to ask. She had her own lawyer by the end of the week, a former professor named Adrian Sokol, who now practiced in Mississauga and who had taught Sera evidence law and who did not waste words. Sera laid out everything on Adrian's desk and watched her read without interrupting. Adrian set down the last page. "You understand that some of this will overlap with the Beaumont matter, even though you've recused yourself. I understand. He's going to have a very difficult year." "He made that decision," Sera said, "not me." Adrian nodded once and reached for her pen. The harder call was the one she made to Sandra. She drove to Oakville on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the Thursday stakeout, and parked in a Tim Hortons parking lot 3 blocks from Birchwood Crescent, and sat there for a while with her coffee going cold. She had written out what she wanted to say. She had rehearsed it 3 times in her car on the way down. She was a person who prepared for difficult conversations, and she did not think that made her cold, just careful. She called Sandra at 9:15. Sandra picked up on the 3rd ring. Sera said, "My name is Sera Calloway. You don't know me. I was briefly assigned to your divorce file before I withdrew due to a conflict of interest." A pause. "I'm Marcus Whitmore's wife." Silence on the line, a long silence. Then Sandra said very quietly, "Wife, yes." Another silence. Sera heard her breathing shift. "We've been married 4 years, Sera said. Together for 5. I found out through your intake file. I left the case immediately, and I've engaged my own counsel. I'm not calling you for any legal reason. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know the complete picture, and because whatever happens next, I want to make sure your children are protected." There was a sound on the other end that was not quite crying and not quite not. "He told me he was separated," Sandra said finally. "He said the divorce was almost finalized. He said it every time I asked." "I know." A pause. "How long have you known?" Sandra asked. 3 weeks. "And before that?" "Nothing," Sera said. "Not a single thing." Sandra made a sound that was both bitter and exhausted and somehow also relieved. The sound of someone whose confusion had just resolved into something terrible, but at least solid, something she could stand on. "What do we do?" Sandra said. Sera said, "I have a very good lawyer, and I'd like to give you her name. Whatever happens in your case, I want you to have someone in your corner who knows the whole shape of this." When Marcus came home that Thursday evening, he set his bag down by the door and kissed her on the cheek and asked if she was hungry. She had made pasta, which she almost never did, because she had needed something to do with her hands. He said it smelled good. He poured himself a glass of water and talked about a meeting he'd had in Etobicoke and asked about her week. He was good at this. She had always thought he was good at the ordinary performance of a person coming home. She watched him move around their kitchen, her kitchen, their home. And she thought about Owen in the red swim shirt and Lily in the yellow boots, and she thought about the 2 years she had spent adjusting her life, her body, her schedule, quietly and without complaint, because she believed they were building towards something together. She ate her pasta. She asked follow-up questions about his meeting. She laughed at the right moments. She was a lawyer. She could cross-examine a witness and never let them see what she knew. She had learned the skill the hard way in a crowded courtroom at 27 years old, and she had not forgotten it. 3 days later, she left. She had arranged it over 2 weeks, quietly and without drama. She packed what was hers. She left behind the rosemary on the windowsill, because it had grown in that kitchen, and she wasn't sure it would survive a move, and she didn't want to think too hard about the metaphor. She left behind the framed print he had given her for their 2nd anniversary, the one from a gallery in Leslieville that she had loved. She left behind a great deal that had been hers, because she did not want to take things that would also carry him. She left behind one thing on purpose. She placed a photograph on the kitchen table, the photo of Owen and Lily at the beach, which she had taken from his desk and carried in her pocket for 3 weeks. She set it face up on the table. Next to it, her house key. Next to that, her wedding ring. No note. She had said enough and would say the rest through Adrian. Marcus called 14 times the first day, then 23 times the second. She did not answer. On the 3rd day, he drove to Deb's house in Hamilton, where Sera was staying in the spare room with the blue curtains, and sat in the driveway for 40 minutes until Deb went out and told him, very calmly, that Sera would be in touch through her lawyer. He called one more time that evening. She answered. He said, "Seth, please just let me explain." She said, "Marcus, I have a complete financial disclosure. I have the secondary account. I have receipts going back 3 years. I have counsel, and so does Sandra Beaumont. There is nothing to explain. There is only what comes next. Silence. This is not punishment," she said. "This is consequence. There is a difference." She hung up. What came next was thorough. Adrian was as good as Sera had believed. The marriage had been entered into under materially false pretenses, which complicated the division of assets in ways Marcus had not anticipated. The financial irregularities in his accounts, money moved between the household budget and the 2nd account in Oakville over 4 years, added a layer that his own lawyer had difficulty untangling. He had believed, as people like Marcus often did, that because he was careful, he was untouchable. He had not counted on his wife being a family law attorney who knew exactly what to look for and exactly where to look. He had also not counted on his business partner, a careful man named Stuart Park. Discovering during the financial disclosure process that client funds had been commingled with Marcus's personal accounts in ways that violated their firm's compliance obligations. Stuart had built the practice over 12 years. He did not call Marcus to discuss it. He called his own lawyer and then a forensic accountant. By February, Marcus's name was off the door and his stake in the firm had been bought out at a number that reflected none of the growth he had contributed to. The professional consequences moved faster than the legal ones. Financial consulting in Toronto was a small world, as it turned out, and the story moved through it with the quiet efficiency of a thing that was simply true. Contracts became contingent on references that were no longer available. A board position on a community foundation was not renewed. The calls became less frequent and then stopped. He ended up in a rented condo in Etobicoke. 1 bedroom, 9th floor, a view of the gardener. Sera heard this through Adrian and did not spend long thinking about it. She spent the months after the separation doing the work of people who have had a significant structure fall. She moved into a rental in Roncesvalles, a bright 1-bedroom with big windows and a kitchen that got afternoon light. She brought the rosemary from Deb's because Deb had picked it up in October, not saying anything about it, just setting it on her passenger seat and driving it to Hamilton. It did survive the move. She went back to work. Family law, the same work, the same crowded courtrooms and tearful depositions and financial disclosures that told the real story of a marriage long before the parties were willing to. She was good at her job because she understood that the people sitting across from her were not statistics. She had always understood that. She understood it more completely now. Sandra called on a Wednesday in April, 4 months after that first phone call in the Tim Hortons parking lot, not to go over the case. The legal matters were proceeding with their own momentum, managed by Adrian and Sandra's new counsel, a woman in Mississauga who Sandra said was thorough in a way she found reassuring. She called because she said Sera was the only person who understood the specific shape of what this had been. Not the betrayal in the generic sense, but the particular architecture of it, the way he had built two lives with the same materials and the same voice and the same easy way of coming home. They met for coffee at a place on Queen West, halfway between their respective neighborhoods. Sandra arrived first. She looked different from the photograph and different from the driveway in Oakville. She looked like herself, which Sera thought was probably the right way to describe it, a person returning to their own shape. They talked for 3 hours. Not about Marcus. They talked about Owen and Lily, who were funny and chaotic, and had very strong opinions about breakfast foods. They talked about Sandra's work, she was a landscape architect, and about Sera's cases and the particular exhaustion of holding other people's crises at arm's length all day. They talked about the strange specific grief of losing a future you had completely planned, every detail of it, the house and the beaches someday, the children she had expected to have by now. Sandra reached across the table at one point and put her hand briefly over Sera's and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Walking back to the Queen streetcar after, Sera thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago in a cottage on Georgian Bay, listening to a man with an easy smile and impractical shoes and thinking she had found something real. She hadn't been naive. She had been paying attention to the right things. The problem was that he had been more careful than she knew to look for. She thought about her clients, the ones who said I never suspected, the ones who said the signs were there, but I loved him, the ones who said I was so good at making excuses for the small things. She had never been without compassion for those clients. She had more now. She started taking on a few more pro bono cases, women in complicated situations, children who needed someone in their corner. Her assistant Priya said she was becoming a different kind of lawyer. Sera thought that wasn't wrong exactly, but wasn't quite right either. She was the same lawyer. She had simply quietly updated her understanding of what was at stake. 5 months after moving to Roncesvalles, she started sleeping through the night again. She considered that a meaningful data point. She met Theo Sullivan the following October. She was at a gallery opening in Parkdale that a colleague had dragged her to, a small space on Dundas, with concrete floors and wine in plastic cups, and a photographer whose work she actually liked. She had been looking at a photograph of the Scarborough Bluffs in winter when someone stopped beside her and looked at it for a while without saying anything. He said eventually, "I've driven past those bluffs 100 times and never stopped." She said, "I think that's most people." He said, "I stopped last February after a long time of not stopping at things." She looked at him then. He was tallish, dark-haired, somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of face that was easier to read in motion than in stillness. He had a quality of attention that she noticed. The way he looked at things, the way he meant to look at them. He introduced himself. Theo. He asked what she did. She said family law. He made the face everyone made and said that must be hard. She said it was also important, and he said yes, that's probably why it's hard. And she thought that was a more honest response than she usually got. He was a general practitioner in Etobicoke. He had a small practice, 3 days a week clinic, and the rest doing research with the University of Toronto on chronic pain management in older adults. He talked about his patients with a matter-of-fact warmth that she recognized, the kind of warmth that didn't perform itself. He asked if she wanted another cup of the mediocre wine. She said she'd rather get actual wine somewhere with actual glasses. He said he knew a place on Roncesvalles. She laughed at that and told him she lived on Roncesvalles. He said that seemed like a reasonable sign. They had actual wine at a small place on her street that she had walked past many times without going in. It was good. They talked for 2 hours. She did not tell him about Marcus. Not yet. But she was not performing ease either. She was simply there, in the conversation, which she had not quite managed in social situations for most of the previous year. He asked if he could call her. She said yes. He called 2 days later, in the evening, a Wednesday, and they talked for 90 minutes about things that had nothing to do with either of their professional lives, and she realized at some point that she had been sitting on the floor of her living room without noticing when she sat down. They saw each other 3 weeks later. A restaurant on College Street, not too formal, just comfortable. He stood when she arrived, not because he was performing courtesy, but because he'd been watching for her, she could tell. He listened the way people listen when they are genuinely interested and not simply waiting for their turn. When she finally told him carefully and without drama something of what the past year had been, he did not rush to fill the space after she finished. He said, "That sounds like it required a lot of quiet strength. I hope you know it shows." It was a simple thing to say. She thought about it on the streetcar home. She thought about it the next morning. She watched how Theo moved through his life over the following months. He was the kind of person who did the unremarkable things and did not expect recognition for them. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered things she mentioned once. A client situation that had bothered her, a neighborhood bakery she wanted to try, her preference for tea over coffee after noon. He did not try to rescue her from her own past. He simply existed beside her with a steadiness that did not need to announce itself. She kissed him for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in the Roncesvalles kitchen, while he was helping her repot the rosemary, which had outgrown its original container and needed more room. The conversation had been about root systems, and he said something that made her laugh, and she turned and kissed him before she thought about it, and then pulled back and looked at him. He looked back, steady and warm and entirely unhurried. She kissed him again. He proposed the following spring, not in public, not with an audience. He made dinner in her kitchen one Saturday evening, an elaborate project involving several pots and a recipe he had clearly been practicing, and partway through, they abandoned the cooking to eat what was already done and sit on the kitchen floor with the second bottle of wine, because neither of them could explain why the floor felt right, but it did. He reached into his pocket and held out a ring, simple gold band, a small oval stone the color of water. He said, "I want to be somewhere you always feel safe. I want to be the most reliable part of your day. I want to grow old with you in this apartment, and in better apartments, and eventually in whatever house we find with the backyard you mentioned once in September, and I have been thinking about ever since." She looked at him, at his face, at the kitchen floor, at the rosemary in its bigger pot on the windowsill. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He laughed, which broke the formality of it entirely, and she grabbed his face and kissed him, and the ring was on her finger, and the kitchen smelled like whatever they had abandoned on the stove, and neither of them cared. They married in June, a small ceremony at a vineyard in Prince Edward County. Deb was her witness, standing beside her in a pale green dress and crying before the ceremony started because, she said, she had earned the right to cry immediately. Theo's older sister Margot stood beside him, a quiet and precise cardiologist from Vancouver who had flown in 2 days early and had spent most of the pre-ceremony time making Sera feel, without fanfare, like someone she had known for years. Sera wore her grandmother's earrings. She carried garden flowers, nothing formal. She walked toward Theo under an open sky on a warm June afternoon, and she was not nervous, which surprised her. She thought she would be nervous. Instead, she felt clear, like walking into a room where you already know the answer. When she reached him, he looked at her for a moment and said, quietly, just for her, "There you are." She laughed. She was also crying. She was both things at once, and it did not feel contradictory. They made their promises in front of 22 people who had known them through the difficult years and showed up anyway, and when it was done, Deb said later, the whole small gathering felt like an exhale. There was one thing Sera had been quiet about for a long time. The year of trying before everything fell apart, the careful schedules and the disappointment, and the particular loneliness of a grief no one could quite see from the outside. She told Theo early, when they were still new, because she had decided she would not carry things sideways into a new life. He listened and held her hand and said he was glad she told him and that he would want to know everything that mattered to her, always. He had a colleague, a reproductive endocrinologist named Dr. Anand Patel, who Theo spoke highly of in the quiet way. He spoke highly of people who were genuinely good at what they did. With Theo beside her, Sera made an appointment. Dr. Patel spent 90 minutes at their first meeting. He reviewed everything. He asked questions the previous doctors had not asked. He was interested in the whole picture rather than the individual data points. When the results were compiled, he sat across from them and spoke in the careful language of someone who knew the difference between false hope and real possibility. He said, "There are a few things working against you that are addressable. None of them are the things you were probably blaming yourself for. A mild autoimmune response, subclinical inflammation, progesterone timing that had been slightly off in every previous attempt, individually easy to miss, together enough," he said. "Your body was trying. It just needed the right support." She looked at Theo, who was looking at her with the same expression he always had, like he had all the time in the world and planned to spend it here. She squeezed his hand. They did not rush. They followed the protocol. They let the months move at their own pace. She did not track obsessively. She took the medications and she tried, with mixed success, to believe that some things resolved in their own time. On an ordinary Tuesday morning in November, in the bathroom of the Roncesvalles apartment, she stood with a test in her hand. She had done this before. She knew the specific silence of those 2 minutes. She had learned, through long experience, not to place too much weight on any single moment of them. She looked down. Positive. She read it again. She held it for a while without moving. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the tile. She looked at the rosemary through the bathroom window, visible from the hallway. She sat down on the floor. She had sat on a floor before in a difficult moment and wept with her fist against her mouth so she would not make a sound. She sat on this floor differently. She sat with both hands around the test, and she let herself cry with the full sound of it, quietly but completely, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday morning. Theo knocked gently. She got up and opened the door. She held up the test. He looked at it, then at her. He crossed the small space of the hallway and held her, his arms fully around her, his face in her hair. She could feel how still he went, and then the slow loosening of something enormous. "Hi," she said into his shoulder. "Hi," he said back. His voice was a different shape than usual. They stood there a long time. The first ultrasound was at 9 weeks. Theo sat beside her, Sera on the narrow table, and they both looked at the screen when the technician turned it. The technician went quiet in the way that people go quiet when they are processing something they want to present correctly. "I want to show you something," she said. 2 heartbeats. Theo made a sound with no word in it. He pressed his forehead to the side of Sera's head, and she felt him shake once, just once, before he steadied. She thought about the Etobicoke condo, the 9th floor view of the gardener. She thought about Owen and Lily at the beach, their father elsewhere, their mother crouching on the front steps to do up a jacket. She thought about Sandra's voice on the phone saying, "wife," like it was a word she had to learn the weight of for the first time. She thought about who she had been standing in the Oakville Tim Hortons parking lot with a cold coffee and a decision to make. That woman had been terrified and had been brave, and had refused to become the kind of person the worst thing that happened to her wanted her to be. She looked at the screen. At the 2 small lives there, she felt Theo's hand tighten around hers. The babies were born in late July, a Thursday, the kind of warm Toronto Thursday where the air off the lake was almost bearable. Nora came first, alert and wide-eyed, immediately interested in the world. James came 3 minutes later, loudly and with apparent objections, and the delivery nurse laughed and said that one has opinions. Theo held Sera's hand through every hour of it, his forehead against her temple, his voice low and steady, and when Nora was placed on Sera's chest, He bent his face down and stayed there, and she felt him breathing, just breathing, like a person returning from somewhere difficult. He looked at her. He put his hand against her face. "You," he said, "only that." She turned her face into his palm. Deb arrived 2 hours later with an enormous and completely impractical bouquet and sat beside the bed and looked at James and Nora for a full silent minute and then said, "Sera Calloway. Sarah Sullivan now." Sera said. Deb laughed, the long kind. Sandra sent white tulips and a card that said only, "You always knew how to find your way through. I'm so glad you did." She had included a drawing from Owen, a purple house with a yellow sun. His name printed carefully in one corner. Sera read it twice. She set the card on the windowsill next to the 2 small bassinets where Nora and James slept in the warm afternoon light, their breathing slow and matching. She looked at Theo, asleep in the chair with his hospital bracelet still on, completely undone and completely at peace. She looked at her children. She thought about the woman who had sat in a Tim Hortons parking lot on a cold March morning with a file folder and a phone and a decision to make about what kind of person she was going to be. That woman had not crumbled. She had assessed, she had planned, she had protected the people who needed protecting, including herself. She had walked through a very difficult room and come out the other side without becoming bitter, without becoming small, without letting the worst of what she had experienced define the shape of everything after. She had earned this room, every quiet thing in it. Theo stirred. His eyes found her first, the way they always did. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," she said back. He reached across and found her hand and held it without needing to say anything else. Outside, Toronto was warm and loud and entirely itself, the city where she had learned, with great precision and some pain, the difference between a man who was good at seeming and a man who simply was. She knew the difference now. She was holding his hand.